Hi everyone, this is Laura Slade, and in today's lesson, I want to talk to you about a very important concept in our discussion of the endocrine system. And that is the idea of how our bodies are able to maintain homeostasis through a few different important control mechanisms. Now, homeostasis is a word that we should be familiar with by now. Homo, that means same, and stasis means state. So homeostasis just describes when our bodies are able to maintain the same state over a long period of time. Now, my question for you is, why is balance so important? Can you have too much of a good thing? Well, it turns out that in our bodies, balance is absolutely essential because even good things can be bad in high doses. And a good example of this is blood sugar. So blood sugar, in other words, blood glucose, is the molecule that our bodies use for energy, goes into cellular respiration to create ATP, and every single cell in our body needs that blood sugar as fuel for its energy production. So why is it so important for us to maintain a constant level of blood sugar over time? Well, high blood sugar is a condition known as hyperglycemia. Now, glycemia, that refers to the glucose molecules that make up these sugars. Hyper literally means above and beyond, so too much blood sugar. Well, actually, this can cause things like confusion, hunger, fatigue, trembling, dizziness, and in extreme cases, it can even cause seizures. Low blood sugar is no good either. That's called hypoglycemia. Hypo means under or below. Hypoglycemia causes things like thirst, dry mouth, frequent urination, and in extreme cases can result in going into a coma. So here we see that it absolutely is essential for our blood sugars to stay in balance. You can have too much of a good thing. So the mechanism by which our body maintains this control, this balance of levels of our different traits, it acts just like the thermostat in your house. Your thermostat is designed to maintain a constant air temperature in your house over time. And the way that it actually does that is by turning the heat on and off at particular points in time. It's shown by this graph. We have temperature on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and we're looking at the fluctuation in air temperature over time. The black line on this graph shows us the average air temperature between the highs and lows over the course of time. And what you can see is that the average never changes. There really is homeostasis here because there's no overall change in temperature over the long term. However, if you look at the red line, you'll see that air temperature actually is changing all the time. And this is because our thermostat only has two options. The furnace can be turned on, which makes the room more warm, hotter, or the furnace can be turned off, which makes the room colder. So what your thermos does is it turns on the furnace and allows the air temperature to heat up until it's actually slightly above room temperature. Then it turns the furnace off, lets the house cool down until that temperature drops just slightly below room temperature. Then it's going to turn the furnace on again. And this process is carried out over time so that even though the particular air temperature is always changing, the overall trend stays the same. This type of regulation is called a feedback mechanism, and it turns out the hormones in our body function in exactly the same way. And for that reason, the thermostat is going to be our theme for this lesson. Let's look more specifically at how our bodies maintain this state of balance. So we have two general mechanisms for maintaining balance in our bodies in terms of our hormonal levels. The first one is called a negative feedback loop. And in a negative feedback loop, one hormone that is produced by a particular pathway actually turns itself on and off by affecting other hormones that are what we call upstream in that pathway, so hormones that come before our hormone of interest. So we are going to look at 3 examples of hormonal negative feedback loops as we go through today's lesson. The second general mechanism for maintaining balance in the body is just a slightly different way of accomplishing exactly the same thing. This is called antagonistic hormones. So in this case, we are actually looking at 2 different hormones that do the opposite job of each other. So perhaps one hormone turns the furnace on and the other hormone turns the furnace off. It's still a way of maintaining balance. The only difference here is that 2 hormones are working against each other instead of one hormone working on itself. And we're going to look at 2 different examples of antagonistic hormones as we go through today's lesson. Let's start with negative feedback loops. And we're going to begin by looking at a generalized pathway that could be applied to a number of different specific hormones. What you're going to notice is that most hormonal negative feedback loops begin with the hypothalamus. And this is not surprising because we might be familiar with the fact that the hypothalamus really runs the show when it comes to the internal environment of our body. So the hypothalamus is going to release a hormone. And this hormone, whatever it is going to stimulate the pituitary to produce another hormone that also stimulates an endocrine gland, and that's going to be our target gland. In the presence of that stimulating hormone, the target gland will make our hormone of interest. And this was the whole point, to be able to make some of this end product hormone, whatever it does in the body, whatever it's meant to regulate. But as long as the stimulating hormone is present, the target gland is going to continue to release our hormone of interest, and hormone levels will continually rise. Well, we don't want that. We want a balanced level. So what's going to happen is, as the concentration of our target hormone increases, it is going to cause both the hypothalamus and the pituitary to stop making their hormones. The product here inhibits the start of the pathway from continuing. Well, if you turn off, or if you inhibit the hypothalamus and the pituitary, then we're not able to make stimulating hormone. And if there's no stimulating hormone, then the target gland will stop making our target hormone. This is just like turning the furnace off. But then, of course, as long as the pituitary is inhibited, then our hormone of interest is going to continually decrease in the bloodstream, and that's no good either. So we need this whole process to repeat itself over and over and over. And what we would end up with, if we tracked hormone concentrations in the blood over time, we would get a graph exactly like the air temperature in a room controlled by a thermostat. Whenever our target gland is stimulated, hormone levels will rise. But because of the rise in hormone levels, our target gland will be inhibited, and then hormone levels will again fall. Let's take a look at an example of a specific hormonal pathway that follows exactly this trend. Let's look at the hormone thyroxine, which is in charge of our metabolic rate, how quickly our cells are able to break down fuel and create energy. So again, not surprisingly, this pathway begins with the hypothalamus producing a releasing hormone, which stimulates the pituitary gland to create thyroid-stimulating hormone. Now, they've named this hormone very well because you can see that this hormone is going to stimulate the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland in turn produces thyroxine, and high levels of thyroxine allow our cells to take up and use more fuel and create more energy. But we want the thyroxine levels in our body to stay balanced. If they continue to increase, it can make you anxious and hungry, can cause you to lose excessive amounts of weight and not be able to sleep. That's no good. We need a mechanism for control. So what happens is that high levels of thyroxine will actually stop the pituitary from making more thyroid-stimulating hormone. And if you don't make any more thyroid-stimulating hormone, then you don't make any more thyroxine. As soon as the thyroxine levels fall, then the pituitary can begin to make thyroid-stimulating hormone again. Now, when this system is working, then our bodies are going to be in balance, and the level of thyroxine in our blood will stay relatively constant over time. What happens if something in this system is not functioning properly? Well, that can cause problems in the whole hormone pathway. An example of this is when some people are not actually able to produce the thyroxine hormone molecule. This happens as a result of iodine deficiency because iodine is required for thyroxine production. Well, if you can't make thyroxine, then there is nothing to tell the hypothalamus and the pituitary to stop. There's no way to inhibit the production of thyroid-stimulating hormone. So without thyroxine, if it can't be made, then thyroid-stimulating hormone levels in the blood are going to continually increase. These very high levels of thyroid-stimulating hormone actually aggravate the thyroid and cause it to become irritated and enlarged, and this results in a medical condition known as goiter. So it's a good example of why it's so important for our body to remain in balance. Let's take a look at another negative feedback loop. This one involves the hormone cortisol, which in general is responsible for helping to control our blood pressure. Actually, cortisol is a stress hormone, so our adrenal gland can cause an increase in cortisol production in response to environmental or emotional stress. However, the rest of the time, a low balanced level of cortisol helps maintain our blood pressure. So this hormonal pathway again begins with the hypothalamus, which secretes a corticotropic releasing hormone. This stimulates the pituitary to make adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now remember that tropic means a higher level. So using the word tropic in the name of this hormone tells us that it's somewhere up at the top of this hormonal pathway. It's going to affect an endocrine gland lower down or later on. So as the levels of adrenocorticotropic hormone increase, that's going to stimulate the adrenal gland to make cortisol. Now, we don't want cortisol levels to get too high, so cortisol in turn will inhibit the hypothalamus and the pituitary from making their respective hormones. And without any adrenocorticotropic hormone, the adrenal gland won't be stimulated anymore, and the production of cortisol will stop. Let's take a second to look at a bit of a case study when it comes to problems in this hormonal pathway and this negative feedback loop. So let's talk about Cushing's disease. This is a disease that is characterized by the overproduction of cortisol. This can affect blood pressure, but it also has some other kind of nasty side effects because it tricks your body into thinking that it's stressed all the time. And long-term stress can cause hair loss, weight loss, anxiety, you name it. Now, there's actually two different ways that we can produce too much cortisol. We can produce too much cortisol directly because the adrenal gland is working too hard. That's sometimes caused by an adrenal tumor because tumor cells are capable of overproducing hormones and making those hormone products even when they shouldn't be. The other way that we can make too much cortisol is by making too much adrenocorticotropic hormone. And that happens if the pituitary gland is overactive. This can be caused by a pituitary tumor that continually makes adrenocorticotropic hormone even in the presence of cortisol. So if the pituitary does not respond to high levels of cortisol by inhibiting the production of its hormone, then we're going to keep making adrenocorticotropic hormone and keep stimulating the adrenal gland to make cortisol, and cortisol levels will be too high. On the other hand, if the adrenal tumor is the cause of Cushing's disease, then the adrenal gland is going to continually make cortisol even when there's no adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, cortisol, in this case, can still inhibit the functioning pituitary from making adrenocorticotropic hormone. But low levels of that hormone are not going to stop the adrenal gland from continually producing cortisol. So once the symptoms of Cushing's disease are detected in an individual, you can actually do a blood test to determine what the cause is, pituitary or adrenal gland tumor, by checking for the levels of adrenocorticotropic hormone in the blood. If they're high, that suggests a pituitary tumor is at work. And if they're very low, even in the presence of high cortisol, then that suggests an adrenal gland tumor. I've actually become a bit of an expert on Cushing's disease in this last semester because one of my dogs was diagnosed with it. And when I was at my first appointment with the vet, they were describing these tests to determine which gland might have a tumor in it. And I was sitting in the vet office thinking about my Bio30 curriculum, nodding like, yep, that makes sense, that makes sense. And the vet looks at me and says, do you have a medical background? And I said, no, but I teach Bio30. And he goes, okay, then you know all about negative feedback loops. That's how important this topic is to our understanding of biology and medicine and health. I want to show you one more example of a negative feedback loop, and this is regarding a hormone that we have not learned about yet, and that's the hormone testosterone. So we're going to cover the production of testosterone and its role in the body, particularly males, in detail in our next units on human reproduction. But for now, let's just take this as a preview for what's coming next, because actually, testosterone is also involved in a negative feedback loop. So here's what we see. The hypothalamus, surprise, surprise, secretes a releasing hormone. This one is called a gonadotropin releasing hormone because the gonads, that refers to the ovaries and testes, the testes being the site of production of testosterone. That releasing hormone stimulates the pituitary to make a hormone called luteinizing hormone. For now, all we need to know is that luteinizing hormone stimulates the testes to produce testosterone. But of course, we don't want too much testosterone to be made, so testosterone is going to inhibit both the hypothalamus and the pituitary from secreting their hormones. If the pituitary is inhibited, no more luteinizing hormone is made, and that is going to also inhibit the testes from producing any more testosterone. This is how we're going to maintain a balanced level of testosterone over time. Again, we can talk about one way that we see this negative feedback loop affected in real-world systems, and that is by the use of synthetic steroids. So the type of steroids that we're talking about here are ones that would be ingested or injected in people who are trying to usually build up a lot of body mass. Often these are illegal steroids, especially if you're involved in sports. These steroids really closely resemble the chemical composition of testosterone, and for that reason, they actually perform some of the functions of testosterone, like building muscle mass, but not all of the functions of testosterone. So these synthetic steroids do not help, for example, sperm production. But because these steroids look so much like testosterone, they can inhibit the hypothalamus and the pituitary from making our real version of testosterone. So taking steroids actually decreases your natural testosterone levels by inhibiting the pathway that testosterone is a part of. So now we've seen 3 examples of negative feedback loops, and you should notice that they all follow incredibly similar pathways. In fact, we can use the same flowchart to talk about each one. You could now learn about any other hormone, and if you knew that it was part of a negative feedback loop, you'd be able to draw this flowchart yourself. Let's move on and talk about the second way that our bodies are able to maintain balance. And this is through the use of what we call antagonistic hormones. So antagonist, that means against. just like the antagonist in a novel is working against the hero, while these antagonistic hormones are working against each other. But two hormones doing the opposite jobs are what is going to allow balance to be maintained, or homeostasis to be maintained in our bodies. So what we see on this flowchart is that there are two different possible conditions that can happen to our hormone levels or our internal environment. Either a trait in our internal environment can increase or it can decrease. And what happens with antagonistic hormones is that there is a different tool to fix each of these problems. If a trait increases in our bodies, that's going to stimulate a particular gland to make one hormone. And that hormone, of course, we're going for balance here, so it is going to decrease that trait. So we don't want this increase to become too large. We're going to cause a decrease, and that will bring us back to homeostasis. On the other hand, if this trait ever drops below normal values, if it decreases, that's going to stimulate possibly a different gland to produce a different hormone that will increase this trait in our bodies. Let's go back to our diagram of room temperature with the use of a thermostat. What we want is the increase of a trait and then the decrease of the trait so that we never stray too far from that average line. This time, the way that we're going to accomplish that is by producing a particular hormone to increase the trait and producing a different hormone to decrease the trait. Probably the most common example of this is the balance of blood sugar in our body through two different hormones, insulin and glucagon. So if your blood sugar is increased, that's hyperglycemia. This often happens right after you eat a meal because your body has just digested and absorbed all this glucose. Well, we know that hyperglycemia is a bad thing. So high blood sugar is going to cause the pancreas to produce the hormone insulin. Now, the job of insulin is to go out to all of the cells in your body and tell them to take up the glucose out of your bloodstream. That glucose can be used in your muscle cells, or it can be stored in your liver. Either way, this causes the sugar in your blood to decrease. Well, we've corrected the original problem that came from eating a big meal, and we're back to our balance level. We've maintained homeostasis. On the other hand, if you don't eat for a long time, especially if you skip breakfast, you should never skip breakfast, but if you do, your blood sugar levels are going to decrease. This also affects the pancreas, but this time it causes the pancreas to secrete glucagon. And glucagon allows your liver to break down its stored glucose and release some of that into your bloodstream, thus increasing your blood sugar. We've corrected our original problem, and again, we're back at homeostasis. Now, just like we looked at Cushing's disease for negative feedback loops, we can give an example of a human condition or disorder that is caused by antagonistic hormones that don't function properly. And the classic example for this is diabetes. Now, in diabetes, your pancreas either does not produce enough insulin, that's referred to as type 1 diabetes, or your body cells don't respond to the insulin that's in your blood, that's type 2 diabetes. Either way, what's happened in diabetes is that we have broken the tool that was meant to fix high blood sugar. Now, there's nothing that glucagon can do about high blood sugar other than stop functioning. But if you've just eaten a big meal, especially if it's full of carbohydrates, without insulin, we cannot decrease our blood sugar. So diabetics are prone to hyperglycemia, especially after they've eaten. And really the only ways that we can treat this is either by changing our eating habits to make sure that we never actually increase our blood sugars that much, or by taking a synthetic form of insulin that does that job for us. just for a bit of variety, let's look at one other example of antagonistic hormones. And these are the hormones that are responsible for managing the calcium in your body. Now, calcium is hugely important. We probably know that calcium is used to build strong bones. So your bones need to take up calcium in order to function. You might not know that calcium is also really important in the blood. It's important for things like blood clotting. It's also used in muscle contractions. And your nerve cells actually need calcium as well to help your nerves function. So we've only got so much calcium in our bodies. We've got to divide it up equitably, whether or not that's evenly, between the bones and the blood. This is done by two different hormones, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. And they're actually made by what we describe as two different glands. So, if there's too much calcium in your blood, and therefore not enough calcium in your bones, it stimulates the thyroid to produce the hormone calcitonin. And calcitonin decreases your blood calcium by moving that calcium into your bones. So calcitonin, you can remember that as calcium into your bones. On the other hand, if you have low volumes of calcium in your blood, it's going to stimulate the parathyroid gland to produce parathyroid hormone, which then increases the blood calcium levels by taking that calcium out of your bones. So, what have we learned so far? We've learned that our bodies work just like a thermostat. They maintain balance in the body. They maintain homeostasis by never letting a little change become a big change. So we maintain our environment, our internal environment, close to that ideal average. We've looked at how this is achieved through negative feedback loops, such as the ones involved in thyroxine, cortisol, and testosterone. And we've also looked at how this can be controlled by two different hormones at the same time. We call those antagonistic hormones, and our examples were the insulin and glucagon together, and parathyroid hormone and calcitonin together. But at the end of the day, our goal is for our internal environment, our body, to look just like room temperature, never straying too far from average. Now, we've looked at only a few examples of medical conditions that occur when these controls are not in place, but there are many, many more human diseases and disorders that are caused by similar processes. So why don't you go ahead and do a search on the internet for a certain medical condition that's caused by hormone imbalance. And I bet you that if you can find out just one little part of that medical condition, you'll be able to work out what must be true about the rest of the hormonal feedback loop just from the information that you have from today. Well, that's it for this lesson. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you guys next time.